much, David. And thank you to BRLSI for this opportunity to talk to you about a difficult but important subject. As you've heard, I'm a recycled GP, and I've been working with freedom from torture for about 7 or 8 years. But my interest in the experience of refugees goes way back to the early 1970s, when I was a volunteer teacher in East Africa. And I was there at the time that Idi Amin was expelling the Ugandan nations, and I ended up traveling back to the UK with some of them. And that gave me a very limited but really powerful insight into what it must be like to flee your homeland. Right, now I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see if that works. Hooray, lovely. Okay, so my plan for this evening is to talk about a little bit about what freedom from torture does, give you some background and what I do there. I'm going to look at what torture is, whether it works, how and where it's used around the world. And then I'm going to look about how torture could be prevented and why I think it's time to talk about torture. So I'll be taking questions at the end, and I'm very glad that Tracy Doig, as you've heard, from Freedom from Torture, Head of International Advocacy, is going to join me for that. So, first of all, what exactly is torture? This is the definition of torture in international law. And before going any further, I'd like to point out that quite aside from any moral arguments, torture is always illegal. The ban against torture is absolute. It's a fundamental principle of international law that's accepted by the global community of states and from which no exemption is allowed. So that means that there are no circumstances whatsoever where it's okay to torture, whether in war or any other public emergency. Torture can be inflicted by doing something, beating, burning, sexual assault, or by withholding something, for example, food, water, light, clothing. It can be physical or mental pain, psychological torture, for example, telling someone you're going to kill them or rape them, or kill or rape a member of their family. It must be done for a purpose. You'll see some examples on the slide, and done by somebody acting in an official capacity. And the UN Convention Against Torture also covers cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and punishment. And that includes acts which cause a lesser degree of suffering or which aren't inflicted for a particular purpose. For those of you who are not familiar with freedom from torture, I'll just say briefly what we do here, and then there'll be a bit more detail later on. So this is our website, which I think puts it quite succinctly. Around the world, torture is still used to silence and destroy lives. We stand with survivors, providing therapy and support and fighting for change together. And then up here it says rebuilding lives. So that involves providing specialist psychological therapy to help people recover and rebuild their lives in the UK. And then empowering survivors, which is really important. I have feedback. Does anybody else have that noise? Ah, good. So empowering survivors. So with survivors, we campaign for change in the UK and across the world. And together we raise awareness and influence decision makers about torture and its impact. We also have a medico-legal report service where doctors like myself listen to the accounts of torture survivors and document their physical and psychological scars to help their asylum claims. But why is it time to talk about torture? Well, last year, a Freedom from Torture poll conducted by YouGov in the UK found that more than 4 in 10 Britons, that's 43%, are unsure whether torture is always wrong. So that's 43% of people unsure whether torture is always wrong. And worryingly, young people seem more ready to accept the idea of torture. So while about 2/3 of the over 50s thinks torture is wrong under any circumstances, only 45% of people between the ages of 18 and 24 agree. So why do we think this might be? Well, perhaps it's down to the depiction of torture in television dramas as a quick way to extract information. Dramas such as the American series Game of Thrones, 24, Homeland, NCIS, and the film Zero Dark 30. The popularity of torture as a plot device in ticking time bomb dramas often suggests that torture is an acceptable and maybe even an essential way of extracting information. But is that true? Does torture work? So this is Mark Fallon, who's a former counterintelligence officer of 30 years experience, who worked with NCIS, the Department of Homeland Security, and the US Department of Defense investigating Al-Qaeda.
I'm Mark Fallon. After September 11th, I was the chief investigator for the Al-Qaeda terrorist network for trials before military commissions. Torture is an act of cowardice. Torture produces tainted evidence and corrupted intelligence. Flawed decisions are made based on torture, and we've seen that time and time again. So it is not a practice that anyone who's a professional in the industry would utilize. Torture produced fabricated information from Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, which helped drive the United States and United Kingdom to go to war with Iraq. People often cite the ticking time bomb or other scenarios to say, this is why we need to torture. Why would you want bad information more quickly by torturing it out of a person?
And certainly that's my experience. The people I see regularly tell me that they're asked to give information, identify co-conspirators, or sign confessions about things that they haven't done. And just to avoid further torture, they'll say or do anything just to stop the pain. Torture advocates have touted the successes of the CIA using abusive interrogation after 9/11, but the Senate Intelligence Committee report on CIA interrogation and detention shows that the tactics were much less effective than the CIA claimed and did not result in unique information that stopped attacks and saved lives. Research has shown that techniques which are respectful and build rapport are much more effective at getting reliable information. Retired General James Mattis, when asked by Donald Trump about waterboarding, told him he had always found beer and cigarettes more effective. Neuroscience research also shows that torture and abuse are ineffective ways to interrogate prisoners. In the book on the right, Professor Shane O'Mara explains that abusive interrogation techniques, both physical and psychological, can compromise memory, mood, and cognitive function, which are essential to eliciting accurate information. Torture can certainly be effective as a punishment. It belittles people, it damages them physically and psychologically, but it also builds resistance. I often see people who've been detained and tortured for political reasons on several occasions, often with escalating violence. Their initial experiences usually make them more determined to carry on with their cause. So despite all this, Donald Trump says he believes torture works, absolutely, and indicated that he wanted to bring back so-called enhanced interrogation techniques such as waterboarding, which simulates drowning. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil has certainly spoken out in favour of torture, praised torturers, and has begun dismantling his country's mechanism for combating and preventing torture. The UK also has a case to answer. It was complicit with the US in the extraordinary rendition and torture of people after 9/11, and the government's still blocking an independent inquiry into this. Boris Johnson's government says it's against torture and war crimes, yet it's currently enacting a law to give immunity from prosecution to service personnel for crimes committed abroad more than 5 years ago. Crimes that could include torture. So where's torture taking place? Most countries of the world have ratified the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which means that these states accept that torture is absolutely prohibited and never justified. Despite this, in the 5 years up to 2013, Amnesty International received reports of torture from 141 countries in all regions of the world. 141 countries. So this map highlights the countries from which freedom from torture received most referrals in 2018. I'll give you a second just to have a look. You may be surprised that for the last 10 years or so, Sri Lanka in the middle here is the country from which we receive most referrals. Despite being Lonely Planet's top tourist destination in 2019, and despite the fact that the civil war against the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, ended in 2009, the security forces continue to torture people of Tamil ethnicity because of alleged links to the LTTE. So this happened after President Mahinda Rajapaksa, under President Mahinda Rajapaksa after the civil war. It continued after 2015, when a supposedly more human rights friendly government came into power under President Sirisena. And last year, Mahinda Rajapaksa and his brother Gotabaya were back in power, despite their alleged track record of war crimes, mass torture, and suppression of press freedom. The head of the armed forces is an alleged war criminal. And despite all this, the UK currently still provides training for Sri Lankan troops. So moving over here, people from Iran have been coming to us for decades. The government there uses torture to create fear and suppress political dissent and punish activities such as listening to Western music or owning books about a religion other than Islam. In Afghanistan, we see evidence of torture by the state to get information against the Taliban, but also torture by the Taliban of people who refuse to join them or refuse orders. And most of the Afghan people we see are children or young people. Down here in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, for many years we've seen torture, and particularly sexual torture and rape, used to silence political opposition and human rights activists. In 2019, Joseph Kabila lost power there, and we're watching to see whether his successor, President Tshisekedi, will follow through on promises to improve human rights in the DRC. Moving up to Turkey, the attempted coup in 2016 brought human rights abuses to the attention of the world. But for decades, we've seen torture there to repress the Kurdish people and suppress political involvement. And finally, I'll just mention Cameroon, one of several countries from which we commonly see people who've been tortured for their sexuality, where LGBT people are persecuted and subjected to torture and inhuman and degrading treatment. So clearly this map doesn't mean that these are necessarily the only countries where torture is most practiced. Not all torture survivors want to flee or are able to flee, and not all of those who flee come to the UK. So I'm now going to look at what happens to the torture survivors who do come to the UK. And I'm sure you're aware that claiming asylum here is a complex and difficult process. So Freedom from Torture is working with the Home Office to try and improve the quality of its decision-making for torture survivors by improving the training and skills of the case owners who interview and make decisions. Looking at all asylum cases, that's not just torture survivors, recent figures show that only just under half of the people whose cases were considered by the Home Office were given leave to remain. Many of the negative decisions will be overturned on appeal, but this system is very costly for the government, and it's very damaging for the people concerned who remain in limbo, living on £5 a day and unable to work, often for years. The damage to people's mental health is terrible. You may or may not be surprised to know that people who've been tortured in their country of origin frequently have their claims refused. When we do a medico-legal report by interviewing a survivor, hearing their detailed story, and documenting their physical scars and psychological problems, we can provide medical evidence of torture. We can also explain how their traumatic experiences affect their memory, making it hard for them to give a clear and consistent narrative. Without a medico-legal report explaining this, decision makers often conclude that they're lying and refuse their claim. Research has shown that a medico-legal report from Freedom from Torture approximately doubles the chance of a negative Home Office decision being overturned on appeal. And when we do hear that one of the people that we've interviewed has been granted asylum, it is a red letter day. So Freedom from Torture also work to expose and prevent torture and hold torturing states to account. And one of the ways we do this is by using the anonymized information from all our medico-legal reports to build up a picture of what's happening in a particular country. And we then use that country report to press for change internationally. Rehabilitation is a vital part of our work. We provide psychotherapy and support for people whose lives have been torn apart by torture. And I'm going to let Tracy, one of the torture survivors we've worked with, tell you about it much more eloquently than I possibly can.
There is something good which can come out of a survivor, because survivors of torture are people who are like you and me. It's only that due to circumstances, their life was slowed down a little bit. Before I started coming to Freedom from Torture, it was just like a human shell, because the inner me was already finished, because I did not know who I am. I had lost everything. My family, my child was left behind, and I was just me. So no one to talk to. But the Freedom of Torture supported me to make it possible that, although there was an 8 years gap of separation, they made me to realize that, I can still be a mother to my daughter. If it was not the rehabilitation, I don't think so. I was able to sit here and talk to you about my past. But telling of this story is to kind of people to realize there are certain organizations like Freedom of Torture who have helped people like us to regain their speech, to regain their experience, their resilience, like what I've done right now. But thank God we got Freedom of Torture. We have managed to rehabilitate those people, and they've managed to come back to their own self and do what they can do.
I'll be putting our contact details up at the end if you do want to make a donation. We can't provide therapy for every torture survivor in the UK, but we also provide specialist training for other voluntary organisations and the NHS. The impact of COVID-19 on torture survivors has been devastating. All of our work, both the therapy and the medico-legal work, has had to move on to phone or video, and that makes it a very difficult time for traumatised asylum seekers, who are often already very isolated and struggling with poor housing, poverty, and mental health problems. Survivor empowerment is central to Freedom from Torture's work. We use the expert voices of torture survivors to raise awareness of the issues facing them in the UK and around the world, and to advocate against torture and for awareness of its harmful impacts. Tracy, who spoke just now, is a member of our Survivors Speak Out network, and members of the network brief governments, lobby decision makers, and provide evidence to parliamentary inquiries. And this is Kolbasia Hausu, co-founder of Survivors Speak Out, talking to the United Nations General Assembly in 2017 about his work on global action to end the stigma of sexual violence in war. And Kolbasia was recently awarded an MBE for his work. And on October the 28th, our local Freedom from Torture group is hosting an online event where Professor Malcolm Evans from the University of Bristol, who's chair of the United Nations Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture, and Kolbasia, are going to be speaking about the prevention of torture. I think I'm just a bit of a warm-up act here. I'll give you contact details at the end if you'd like to be notified of how to join the event, which with these two eminent speakers, I think will be a very, very interesting evening. So there are also international mechanisms working to prevent torture. This is a map of countries who've signed up to the UN optional protocol on the prevention of torture. So the ones who've signed are represented in dark blue and light blue, and the different colours just depend on when they signed the protocol. So the blue are all the ones that have signed. So this optional protocol requires that countries allow independent international inspection of their detention facilities, and also establish an internal national preventative mechanism to prevent torture. We know that the risk of torture is reduced by monitoring visits and also by access to a lawyer and visits from family and friends. Unfortunately, you may see from looking at this map that many of the countries which we've already seen are torturing their citizens are also signed up to the protocol. So we've got Sri Lanka down here, we've got Turkey over here, Afghanistan, the DRC, and Cameroon, and so on. So there is still much work still to do. So these are difficult times. The leader of the free world says torture's okay. Mechanisms to prevent or prosecute torture are not working. Countries used to be embarrassed by being accused of torture and tried not to leave scars. Yet even after audio and video evidence proved Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in the Saudi consulate, there were no direct sanctions on Saudi Arabia itself. In China, concentration camps and forced are being used against the Uyghurs. And in the UK, we too have questions to answer. We still sell arms to torturing regimes, most notably to Saudi Arabia, but also the DRC and Sri Lanka. The government's planning to enact a law to put a 5-year time limit on the prosecution of UK service personnel for war crimes committed abroad, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm going to ask you to listen to a former British Army officer explaining why this law should not be enacted.
It would break my heart if we passed this. I'm not going to do a sassoon and throw my medals in the river. But I buy into this country, and if we say it's sometimes okay to torture, I think I'd buy out. I'm done. My name is Rob Guymore. I was a British Army officer for 17 years. This legislation is designed to protect people who committed acts in the heat of battle. But torture is a premeditated act. It is an act that is carried out whilst people can hear the gunfire, but they cannot smell the cordite. It is premeditated, therefore it should be punished in the same way any other premeditated crime should be. Torturing people massively encourages the insurgents' recruiting capability. If you are known as a torturing force, or even if there is the perception that you torture, you will encourage the counterinsurgent. Torture is an eternal and existential wrong. It is always wrong. That is why we train to prevent it. That's why we have standard operational procedures to stop it happening at the time. And then retrospectively, we must also punish it. To say torture is sometimes okay is the same as saying rape is sometimes okay.
Oh, sorry. But it'd be wrong not to emphasise that there are hopeful signs. Last year's YouGov poll for freedom from torture revealed that 57% of the UK's population believe that human rights considerations should be part of a trade deal, even if it means that the best trade deal cannot be reached. The lack of selfishness displayed by millions of people during the COVID-19 pandemic and the immense support for the Black Lives Matter campaign indicate that much of society desperately wants a better world. So, a good time to look at what we can do to help stop torture. Public opinion unambiguously opposed to the use of torture is vital for torture prevention to work. The torture ban can't be upheld by legal mechanisms alone, but people who believe that torture is always wrong and who clearly signal that to their governments are just as important. The UK should be a world leader in human rights. We're a member of the UN Security Council, and there aren't that many members who could fulfill that role at the moment. So we should all be talking to friends and colleagues about these issues and lobbying our MPs. And I'd like to ask you to consider supporting freedom from torture. So this is our website at the top. So please do go and have a look, read more about our campaigns and support us with a regular or one-off donation. If you'd like to join our local Bristol and Bath group, which raises awareness of these issues and raises funds for the organisation, these are the contact details. And please contact us if you'd like to be notified of the event on the 28th of October with Professor Malcolm Evans and Kolbasia. I'll put up the details again at the end. So thank you very much for listening, and Tracy and I will be happy to answer questions.
Right, so this is David Haywood again. I'm down here as BRLSI Zoom. I'll change my name. So if you have a question that you would like to ask, what you need to do is to switch on your video, raise your hand, and when I call upon you, unmute so that we can hear your question and we can answer it. So I'm wondering if Mark Cheeseman has got a question. No. So, various people seem to be switching on their microphone, their videos. So I've got a couple of people. Unfortunately, I think it's because I am not the host. I can't see your names when you've got your video up, but maybe Andreas can, because he is the host at the moment. So what I'm going to do, Andreas raised his hand as if he had a question. So I'm going to go to him, and then I'm going to ask if he can help with the questions from the various people who are indicating. Andreas.
Thank you, David. I've just made you host again, so I think you should be able to see them.
I can now see people's names, yes. But did you have a question?
I do. Alison, first of all, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation that really brought to life the whole issues surrounding torture. The question I have is a very basic one. Is torture, global torture, still as prevalent today as it was, say, 20, 30 years ago?
I think I'm going to pass that one straight to Tracy, because I'm not sure I know the answer to that.
Thank you. Well, I mean, to answer frankly, Andreas, it's very difficult to quantify, but I would say yes, that actually, that despite a decade of concerted effort to eradicate torture and to make people aware of the evils and horrors of torture, that a number of states continue to torture. And as Alison pointed out in her presentation, we seem to be going the wrong way, where even liberal democracies who used to hold the line against torture and used to be at the forefront of torture prevention are now signaling that torture is okay. The United States under Donald Trump, Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro, as Alison pointed out, and even some of the other states that were at the forefront of funding torture prevention efforts, like the Nordic states, are reallocating their funding priorities away from torture. So we really do seem to be in a moment of peril, not to sound alarmist, but that is actually quite frank, that as Alison pointed out, you know, with people who are over 50, they accept that torture is always wrong, or a large proportion, whereas younger people don't hold that same belief. And I think that's a combination of decades of chipping away at absolute torture ban, and that's quite disturbing for a forward trajectory.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. What I'm going to do now is go to Linda Waltz. I'm trying to unmute you, Linda. Can you?
Yeah.
There you are.
I've unmuted myself. Thank you, Alison. Clear and very thought-provoking as ever. I guess one of the things that really strikes me is you know, talking about the number of countries that are signatories to the conventions and to these agreements that, you know, that torture is a bad thing, who are perpetrators of torture. So it's, I guess I'm sort of feeling, what do we do with those? What does it mean to sign up to one of those conventions, one of those agreements, if actually you just turn around and go off and use torture? And what, you know, do the other members of the club, if you like, have they got any kind of way of dealing with that? You know, can they turn around and say, well, you have to stop being a signatory because you're quite clearly not sort of conforming to it? Yeah, so just sort of, you know, we're always looking for ways of getting people together to sort of agree things and sort of sign things together, but it feels like, you know, like a piece of paper that's not really doing anything. So I just wondered what your thoughts, or maybe Tracy's thoughts, were sort of on that situation, really.
I think that's definitely one for Tracy too.
You're absolutely right, Linda. It can be quite disheartening that...
We're losing you.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. I forgot to unmute myself. I was saying that it can be quite disheartening that these very well thought through legal mechanisms are not effectively monitored and policed. And that's not through lack of trying, or the fact that very capable people are trying very hard to ensure that the Committee Against Torture, or the Human Rights Council, or the Security Council, has the information that's necessary. It's just that other than the Security Council, none of the other United Nations mechanisms, and certainly not the Committee Against Torture, actually has a sanctions function. So they can't actually take active steps in a state that continues to flout the law. And that's why, you know, as Alison pointed out in her presentation, it's so essential that we move away from looking at purely legal or international mechanisms to hold the line, that everyday citizens need to become more actively involved in speaking out against torture, holding their own to account, so that we can re-energize the traditional allies of the torture ban, the liberal democracies that used to speak out, that used to, through trade deals or through diplomacy, used to effect sanctions against that didn't obey the rules. But that's all filtering away. And so it really is quite vital that we go back to basics, so to speak, and that everyday people, citizens of countries that believe that torture is wrong, step up and also get involved in the fight back.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Yes, Peter, I'll take you now. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question? We're trying to unmute you, Peter. It's sometimes, there you go.
I think I'm unmuted.
You are.
What worries me is that the whole debate about torture, human rights and everything else is the main advocates are actually in decline. That liberal democracy seems to be on retreat. And so our voice in the world, our voice in the United Nations, our voice amongst what we thought of as a Western democracy is sadly weakened. We are weakening it. The United States is a disaster case as we are. So we have bigger fish almost to fry than torture. We have the very existence of liberal democracy totally at bay. How do you fit your very important preoccupations within the context of what is happening in the geopolitical world? End of question.
Well, I think I'd like to hear what Tracy has to say on that.
I was going to say, shall I take that one?
Yes.
I would argue, Peter, that actually torture is fundamental to human rights. That if we're prepared to cross the line of torture, which is the most abhorrent of acts, then what hope can there be for other rights that are perhaps less understood or it's obvious? And therefore, so when I said, you know, we need to go back to basics and to hold the line again with the torture ban, is that there's absolutely 101 other issues that are deeply pressing, existential issues, the climate crisis, you know, and multiple others. And yet, well, we firmly believe at Freedom from Torture that the ban against torture and the erasing of the absolute ban against torture is equally as important, because if we cross that red line, then everything else is up for grabs. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Can I just interrupt once more on that? I agree with you. All I'm suggesting is that the Western democracies, as we used to be regarded as liberal democracy, has not now seemingly the authority, either in the UN or other bodies, to deliver what we want in terms of a global legal norm?
Yes, I would agree with you. I would agree that a number of states that used to a strong leadership role in the multilateral institutions of the United Nations, etc., are abdicating that space. I think some other states are stepping into that, and I think that's why Alison made the plea. I've made the plea that it's on citizens of those states to actually agitate and make the demands of governments. This particular government is quite happy to pay lip service to humans, and yet does not seem to be delivering on that either in its domestic policies or international policies, although saying that we were quite delighted to see the introduction of the sanctions legislation that was introduced a couple of weeks ago, and the placing of several, I think 25 Saudi officials who were linked to Jamal Khashoggi's murder, as well as a handful of others. So that is obviously very reassuring signs, and we know that the current Foreign Secretary is very committed to upholding the ban against torture. He, having spent time at The Hague himself, is somebody who is quite passionate in fighting against those that torture. So that is reassuring to know. But we can't actually sit back as citizens and expect governments to obey the law anymore. I think that an active citizenry, sorry, if I'm mispronouncing that word, is what's required, and particularly that I look at. I can't see everybody on the call, so I'm not quite sure of the age range, but it really is quite vital that all levels of society get involved, and that everybody who perhaps was part of the fight back against torture 20 years ago, 30 years ago, is picking that up again, reminding others why the torture ban is so important, that the young people who so alarmingly believe that torture is sometimes okay. And that's also very much in the context of a counter-terrorism and post-9/11 world that we inhabit, and that the reality that I think many of us believe that it's okay to give up our human rights in exchange for security, which is not an acceptable trade-off, and we shouldn't have to do that, but it's unfortunately an increasing rhetoric that we're being exposed to. And I think it's something that we need to engage with and speak about and make noise about, and hold our politicians to account on.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go first to Mark Cheeseman and then to Martin Smith. So Mark, I notice you're already unmuted. So if you ask your question, and then I'll come to you afterwards, Martin.
One of the ways people can be held to account is by embarrassing them. And of course, that's to a large degree how Amnesty International works. It writes to people and says, what are you doing? And usually uses ordinary citizens to do that. And however cynical many of these rulers may be in private, they do not like to be shown up as bad people. And I just wonder what role there is in torture prevention of just plainly embarrassing governments and saying in that way, not just would you please keep to your legal requirements, but what do you think you're doing? Basic humanity, basic decency. Can you see that kind of advocacy being useful?
I see.
I do actually. I'm a firm believer in that torture takes place in the darkness, and that any activity that would shed light on actions goes some way towards preventing. I can give it, an anecdote of some of you may be wondering where my accent is from. I'm from Zimbabwe. I was involved in a women's organization in Zimbabwe that was not popular with the state, and many of our members ended up being detained And one of the actions that supporters used to do was call the police station and ask the officer in charge about the well-being of the detainees. And that was a superbly efficient protection for those people, because the police officer knew that people knew that they had been detained and that they were being watched, so to speak. So I do think that activism can play a role. I do think that organizations that, the role that Freedom from Torture plays in presenting the forensic documentation that's done by experts like Alison to document torture, which is then we use to expose the patterns of torture. It's very difficult for states to wriggle out of evidence that has been collated by specially trained forensic experts, medical experts like Alison. And in fact, Freedom from Torture actually was able to force an admission by the Iranian government at the United Nations that they used torture, because they couldn't actually disagree with the evidence that had been presented to them by the Special Rapporteur on Iran, but from Freedom from Torture. And similarly, I've been in the room in Geneva when the Congolese minister has been presented with evidence from Freedom from Torture, and she just blatantly ignored the question. But she was made very uncomfortable for a very long time by very dogged members of the Committee Against Torture who kept repeating and presenting her with the evidence. So I do agree with, I think that embarrassment, that people presenting evidence, it may not always work. So we do need a basket of tactics if we want to, and the fact is that only relying on the legal mechanism simply hasn't worked. So at this point, we need to reassess our tactics and see what else we can bring to bear.
Okay, thank you very much, Tracy. Martin, can you unmute yourself, because I think you wish to ask a question?
I hope I've unmuted myself.
You have. That's good.
I wonder, on this business of shaming people and maybe perhaps supporting people, can you tell me, Tracy, what the strength of support there is in the House of Commons from Freedom from Torture? Is there a Freedom from Torture group? And wouldn't it be good to get a few people to say, we do indeed support us? Is there a committee in the House?
Let me unmute myself now. There's not a committee against torture, but obviously there are committees on human rights and on various different countries where torture is a problem. So I would say that there is widespread support across the House, across all parties, for different aspects, shall I say, of Freedom from Torture's work. Because, of course, we also work on asylum issues, as Alison pointed out, and that's not necessarily an issue that has support across the House. So it depends on what issue Freedom from Torture is bringing to Parliament. We certainly support, very passionate support, and I believe very passionate support from one of your local MPs, Diane Debonair, for our work and for the work that we do with torture survivors. There's a number of MPs who are very proud to associate themselves with Freedom from Torture, and we are working on getting support from others. But yes, there's two different issues. On strictly the issue of torture, yes, widespread cross-party support. On the issue of asylum, perhaps less so.
Thank you.
Right, now I'm looking around to see if there are any other questions. I cannot see any other people indicating. So if you want to ask a question, either wave to me and then, I've got Colin Aitken waving. So Colin, can you unmute yourself and raise your question, please?
Yes, Alison, I have a little experience like yourself, but it was from a long time ago.
I remember it, yes.
Well, there we are. And what I have heard so far, among the questions particularly, is a lot of concern about what governments, what we can do to help to stop torture by dealing with governments and dealing on official levels like that. Your experience and my experience was with individuals. And I think I'd like to make a couple of points. I think one of the most important points is to remember that we are dealing with individuals, and that freedom from torture, one of its main functions, if it's not its really main function, is the care of individuals who have been tortured. And we need to emphasize this, as this is the thing that will produce results for individuals. They will get over their post-traumatic stress disorders and such like physical and mental damage that's been done to them with the help of freedom from torture. And if people watching this today take away any message, they should at least take away that message that this is something that we can achieve. We can achieve help for individuals, whereas we may not be able to achieve results with governments. The second point I'd like to make, and maybe you can tell me whether it's still the case, when I was working with you with what was then
Colin, we've lost you a bit. I wonder if you can repeat your question.
Sorry?
We lost you a bit there, I think. I wonder if you could repeat your second point, please.
My second point is, I'll try and be brief then. My second point is that very often the governments don't. They have security forces which are not controlled by government, and many torture victims are abducted to places where not even the government know they're there. The relatives don't know where they are. They're tortured, and they're not always tortured for information. They're just tortured out of badness, really, by the security forces, and not only out of badness, but also to terrorize the neighborhood. Do these comments that I've made strike a memory for yourself, Alison?
I'm sorry, I still didn't get your second point quite. I got the last half of it, but not the first half.
Right. Well, I made 2 points.
Yes, I got the first point. Yes,
got the first point. Well, the second point was that people are abducted and tortured by security forces without the knowledge of their government, which is the most terrifying thing, because there is no way that they can have that their relatives can actually find out who they are, where they are, and try and do something about it.
Were you thinking of a particular country when you spoke about that?
Well, I mean, when my day it was the DRC, it was Libya, it was Sudan, it was Egypt, it was Iran, it was Sri Lanka, all these countries. But I think probably more likely to be Egypt, Iran, and Libya in its day.
Right.
And the Gaddafi regime.
Well, certainly I would absolutely agree with your first point that what we can do for individual torture survivors is hugely important. And it was, you know, how freedom from torture came into being, or when it was the Medical Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture. And it's still a huge part of the work. And I hope that the wonderful video of Tracy speaking about rehabilitation gave people a flavour of that, because I think she said it all. And I think that, you know, the medico-legal work is also hugely important, and we need to be doing more of that. But I think that goes alongside the other work, and that was in a way what I was asked to speak about tonight. So I hope I gave a sort of flavour of all the different things that freedom from torture does. As regards people being abducted and tortured without knowledge of the government, I'm not sure when I'm interviewing a survivor that I know whether they were, abducted with or without the knowledge of the government. I mean, certainly they were abducted by security forces and so on, but I've often felt that there's certainly a regime that at the least is turning a blind eye, if not actually supporting this. And I think countries that have signed up to the optional protocol on the prevention of torture are supposed to have internal mechanisms to monitor what's going on, and countries should be doing that. But yes, there's some bad things going on, and to be honest, I don't always know how much the state is involved.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to kind of have a follow-on question to that, because we know, for example, in America, when they withdraw their troops from countries, they often put other Blackwater and other organizations in to do the stuff that's post-fighting, but it's bringing the population under control. So they kind of outsource their military operations. Maybe, as you've said, Alison, you don't know whether it's the actual armed forces or these third-party organizations that are more likely to torture. Have you got any information on that?
I think it varies from place to place, and I've generally seen. I'm just trying to think. I've generally seen people who claim it's the security forces in their own country, the police, the army, whoever. It's often not very clear, the distinction. But I've generally seen people who say that they've been tortured by the security forces in their country. I'm sure that's not always the case, but that's the ones that I've seen. Tracy may have a better overview.
Yeah, I would say that certainly for the clients who receive services from Freedom from Torture, the perpetrators are primarily state actors, or for example, the countries like Afghanistan or Iraq, where there are state actors that control large swathes of the territory. So, for example, the Taliban or ISIL. In its time, we would see clients who had been tortured by those non-state actors, not necessarily private security actors, so-called private security actors, but non-state actors, armed groups, militia, that would be engaged in hostilities in those war countries.
Okay, thank you. We've got Martin's indicating again. I'll put you I can see you, Martin. I'll come to you, but I've got another person indicating who hasn't asked a question yet, so I'm going to go to her first. Sandra Haywood asking, interesting, worrying to hear that younger people are less likely to be against torture. I think you've probably explained a little bit about this. Why you think this is, but does Freedom from Torture see itself as having a role in trying to counter this trend amongst young people? Do you have special... You're nodding, Tracy, so would you like to give us that? You are indicating quite clearly that you think, yes. Tell us.
Yes, yes, and thank you for that question, Sandra, because we actually do have, we see ourselves as needing to play that role, and very actively that role, and to try and invigorate an anti-torture movement in the UK, and from there hopefully take that global. But that we see young people, people who are concerned about human rights in general, or environmental issues, or feminism, or a number of human rights concerns, but who don't necessarily think that torture is something to be alarmed about. We see it as very much as our role to increase awareness of the importance of the torture ban and to persuade people towards action. So yes, we have a communication strategy, we have a campaign strategies to try and increase awareness in the UK amongst all age groups, but specifically because of the very alarming figures coming from the 18 to 24-year-old group in the poll that Alison referenced, that we see that group as an important one to target. Okay,
thank you. I'm going to go to Martin again, but what I would like to do is to make sure that we don't miss any questions. So if you want to ask a question, either write to me through the chat at the bottom of your screen, or switch your camera on and wave at me. So Martin, ask your next question, please.
Yes, not so much a question, it's that dreaded thing of a comment. We sound as if we're rather good over here and rather nice and have a jolly nice history. I think we need to remember that our record in the former colonies, call them what you will, is absolutely terrible in places like Kenya and elsewhere. That we also have done more than just turn a blind eye to the events that were happening in Northern Ireland, and we are very complicit in much of what the Americans did in Iraq. There is a real problem here in terms of insisting that the security forces and everybody else don't turn a blind eye, that we do have investigations going on, and we shouldn't act as if we're something wonderful. There's all these other countries who say they are, but they're not. We don't play by the rules all the time, and we need more exposure when that happens.
Agreed. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll let you know, Alison and Tracy, that Sandra's thanked you and is very pleased to hear that you're doing work with younger people. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question? If not, I'll just give it a couple of seconds. I can't see anything. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand the host back to Alison so she can put up the information about freedom from torture and other stuff that she's got. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, Alison and Tracy, for responding, well, first of all, giving the talk and then responding to the questions so ably. And thank you very much to Andreas for being the ghost in the machine behind all of this and making sure that it actually worked for us. So I'm going to hand back to Alison to sign off.
Right, thank you very much, David. And these, where are we? Okay. Right, so hopefully those are the contact details again for Freedom from Torture, both the national website and the local group. So contact us at the local group email if you'd like to hear about the event in October, and otherwise would like to join us and support us. Thank you all very much for coming.
Yes, thank you, everybody. I'm just going to leave that up for a couple of minutes so anybody can copy down the details. But we'll sign off in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, David.